there are people who have become landlords either by default or because they're setting up properties to help a child at university and so on, actually. And so what should we be looking for? What's the best thing that would happen in that?
I think it's a way in which many landlords enter the market in buying a property for their son and daughter when they go to university. It provides a couple of needs. One is to provide good accommodation for your child while they're at university, and the other is to get into the market and as a long-term investment. I think if you're borrowing money, the model works slightly better if you have a larger property than a smaller one, because I think the assumption would be your own son or daughter wouldn't pay rent, so you're looking for rent from 2 or 3 of their chums to help pay the mortgage. And that's a model which I think can work quite well. You've got a decision to make whether the property is in the name of the parents or in the name of the son and daughter. Again, both scenarios work. If it's in the parents' name, they would obviously have to declare the rental income. If the property is in the son or the daughter's name, there's quite an attractive relief called the rent-to-room relief, which would mean the first £7,500 of rental income would be exempt from tax, which can be quite attractive. So I think it's
If you reverse that, though, if it's a situation that the property's in the child's name, that does cause problems for the parent if they're having to pay borrowing on something else to take that as income, doesn't it?
It does, yeah, it does.
Yeah, and so care needs to be taken as to how they would drive
you need to plan it very well, because you want to ensure that if there is borrowings on the property, that tax relief will be available. As I've said before, the amount of tax relief on rented properties is shortly to be restricted to a basic 20% credit as opposed to full relief on the mortgage interest. So it's probably less of an impact now than it was in the past, but nonetheless it's far better to get some relief on loan interest than none.
Than nothing at all.
It brings up the whole subject of intergenerational borrowing and mortgages, etc., which used to be more commonplace in the market than they are today. And there's various ways of doing these things, but you're absolutely right, it needs to be structured in the right way. So you could have a scenario where parents are borrowing against their own home to help buy a flat or a property for the son or daughter. They could have it in joint names with the son or daughter. There could be guarantors involved. All different ways of financing these things, but you need to be taking the tax advice first to make sure whichever way you structure the borrowing is going to be the most tax efficient for you and allow you to claim whichever reliefs are available. So I think working in consultation between whoever your lender is and the accountant are absolutely crucial in this one to make sure you get the structure, the ownership of the property right, but also the lending behind it as well.
From a practical point of view as well, I mean, first and foremost, you've got to make sure that what your son and daughter wants to live in is ultimately going to be a good long-term investment further down the line. You mentioned, and it's a very valid point, about having multiple occupants in the property, a bigger property with your flatmates sharing the rent. That brings into the question of an HMO licence. If your son or daughter lives in a property with 2 flatmates, then there is no need for there to be an HMO licence despite there being 3 people in the property, because the son or daughter, if the property is in their name, is actually the landlord, so is not a tenant. If you have 3 flatmates and your son or daughter living in the property, that becomes 3 unrelated tenants, you need an HMO licence. So it starts to get complicated. You then also got to consider if your son or daughter owns the property and is living in it, they can't be named on a lease jointly with the other parties, because then you've got this unusual situation of the landlord is on the lease. So they would need to draw up a lodger agreement between them and the other parties in the property to explain exactly who's paying what rent and what responsibilities they have in terms of the looking after and maintaining the property.
And as soon as you get into the whole HMO scenario, there's different regulations for the council requirements, local authority requirements. There are different lending requirements. Different. Some lenders don't like HMO situations.
None of which are insurmountable.
Exactly, but the whole topic, it opens up new questions and new issues that you need to think about as a landlord.
Indeed. However, but a well-targeted HMO property will be a good long-term investment, because presumably if your son or daughter needs to be near university for their studies, they buy a property that's well suited to that. When they leave, there'll be plenty of that. In Edinburgh, there's 60,000 students in Edinburgh, so there will always be demand. But it just takes some consideration. There's also the question, do we just manage it ourselves? Our son and daughter is looking after the responsibilities of being the landlord, or do we get an agent to look after it? And we've been in situations quite frequently when we've actually got the landlord is the parent, contract. Their son or daughter lives in the property. We manage the property with their son or daughter along with their friends. And what that does is it keeps that professionalism, because it's all very well entering into a property with some chums at university,
friends, yeah.
but suddenly
That
when
can
this
go wrong.
that can go wrong.
Yeah,
That can go wrong.
I'm sure we've all seen that.
We're talking of the situation of going wrong, something you do need to be cautious of. If you do put a property either in joint names of yourself and a child, or even in that child's name, they have a legal status. So if they decide at some point to sell the property and head off to the West Indies, you have lost that. If there are a number of legal obligations, I think you would have to consider at that point as well. And I would certainly recommend that somebody would do that. Mm-hmm. Don't let the tax situation be your only criteria in that event.
I think, to summarise though, if you've bought a good property that suits your son and daughter, certainly in Edinburgh, when they move out, there will be a market for you to continue to rent it. And I think you should have a long-term view on it, way beyond the period of time your son or daughter's in university.
Which is what David has said, that you want to find something suitable in the first place for you.
Yeah.
And then you can keep it perhaps on at a later stage.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good.